We read from Ruth 1. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech, his wife's name Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah, and they went to Moab and lived there. Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. After they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband. When she heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, Naomi and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. With her 2 daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. Then Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show kindness to you, as you have shown to your dead and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." Then she kissed them, and they wept aloud and said to her, "We will go back with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons who could come with your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I am too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters. It is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has gone out against me." At this, they wept again. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. "Look," said Naomi, "your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her." But Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if anything but death separates you and me." When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. So the 2 women went on until they came to Bethlehem. When they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them, and the women exclaimed, "Can this be Naomi?" "Don't call me Naomi," she told them. "Call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Lord Almighty has brought misfortune upon me." Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, arriving in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning. And then we're also reading from chapter 4, from verses 13 onwards. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. Then he went to her, and the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. The woman said to Naomi, "Praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a kinsman redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you and who is better to you than 7 sons, has given him birth." Then Naomi took the child, laid him in her lap, and cared for him. The women living there said, "Naomi has a son," and named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. Thank you, Lord God.
Greetings to you, God's people. Here I am recording again. These Tuesdays come so quickly, but I must be honest, it's something that I look forward to. For in some way that I cannot explain, it does make me feel close to you. We are busy with a series here at church called Skeletons in Jesus' Closet. And as we zoom in on the different characters in the genealogy of Jesus, we stand fascinated to see what lessons there are to be learnt. So the figure for today that we are looking at is Ruth, one of the more familiar figures of the Old Testament. The story takes place at the time of the Judges, and this of course is dated then somewhere between 1200 and 1000 BC. It is before the monarchy was instituted. The story goes as follows. You will have heard excerpts from the book read by Hetty Robb, but I'm just going to give a little bit of context. There had been a famine in Israel, and Elimelech, I'm only going to say his name once, and then when I talk about that guy, you're going to know who it is. I'm not going to twist my tongue every time saying that name that has 4 syllables. Okay, so perhaps one more time, and from then on, that guy, Elimelech, took his wife Naomi and their 2 sons to Moab because of the famine. After they had arrived in Moab, the 2 sons, whose names I won't mention, otherwise you're just going to get so confused, the 2 sons there married 2 Moabitesses, Ruth and Orpah. While there, unfortunately, all 3 men died. Not altogether, however, over a 10-year period. At that point, after a decade in Moab, Naomi heard that the famine in Israel had ended and that God was prospering them again. She then made the fateful decision to return to Israel. As you can imagine, her 2 daughters-in-law wanted to go back with her, Ruth and Orpah. They couldn't think of a life without their lovely mother-in-law. Naomi tried very hard to convince both of them that it's perhaps not the right thing to follow her. Orpah understood and was persuaded to remain in Moab, but Ruth would have no such thing. And she ended up famously saying those words recorded in chapter 1, verses 16 and 17. Ruth saying to Naomi, "There where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your God will be my God, and your people will be my people." It looks like Naomi could do nothing to change Ruth's mind, so the 2 of them traveled to Bethlehem, where they duly arrived safely. The rest of the story is quite interesting and quite entertaining. You can read it for yourself. The book of Ruth only has 4 chapters. I want to focus on what there is to say about what the story means to us as the church more than 3,000 years later. Keeping in mind, of course, that we are studying the skeletons that are hidden in Jesus's closet. It shouldn't come as a surprise to you, but Ruth And her descendants feature in the genealogy of Jesus in Matthew chapter 1. And we have already ascertained with the sermon on Tamar and the sermon on Rahab last week that even sketchy people have a place in God's amazing plan. I hope you're not going to be too disappointed when I tell you that there's not too much dodgy stuff to say about Ruth. Perhaps you are sitting at the edge of your seat looking forward to some thrilling details. After the sermons we had on Tamar and Rahab, perhaps you were silently hoping for a bit of more sketchiness and scandal. Before you switch off, however, let me tell you that there are some significant lessons that we can take from today's study. For it is crucial that we note who Ruth was. She was a foreigner from Moab, and yet she was included in God's plan to fulfill God's purposes for a particular time and in a particular place. What does this teach us then? Because I never want to be a boring preacher, I'm not going to be predictable and give you 3 points like I most often do. Believe it or not, I only have 2 points in store for you today. The first being this: we have to realize that God includes anybody at any time or place to do what He thinks needs to be urgently done. And here we have to pause and acknowledge that God can use even those who are different to us. In a country wracked with racial sensitivity, we better listen up as God's people. And we have to ask ourselves afresh this question: how does God feel about those we so easily classify as foreigners? It seems that God is not bothered by this at all, that the human boundaries and the human class systems that we have put in place are things that God is insulted by. For God is as okay with Europeans as God is with Africans. God can, I say again, use everyone. Everyone, you want to know? Yes, everyone. We have to discuss this issue a little bit. We have to talk about how we feel about those who are different from us and how we treat them. I can vividly remember those terrible xenophobic attacks that arose in this country, most significantly in 2009 and 2015. I know that there have been other occasions where these have periodically arisen, but of course those that we had to face in 2009 and 2015 were the most brutal and the most upsetting. In 2015, I was serving as a Methodist minister in Middelburg, and I was rattled in the extreme, for I served at a congregation which had lots of people from other African nations who worshipped with us and who were even members there. To try and relate to what was happening, to try and negate it in some gentle way, I remember calling up to the front of the church somebody who came from Zimbabwe. I asked him to remove his shoes. I asked one of the leaders to bring a basin filled with water and a towel. I went on my knees in front of the congregation at the Sunday service, and I washed the feet of my brother. That was my noble attempt to speak to my congregation, to show them in a visible way that in God's kingdom everyone is equal, that in God's mind the term foreigner doesn't exist, for God includes all and God embraces all. We cannot hate others just because they are different from us, just because we don't know their lives, their backgrounds, their circumstances, does not mean that we can judge them or write them off. Because God has this thing going of shockingly using whoever He wants to fulfill His purposes. I remember very fondly one of the great Methodist preachers in this country, the Reverend Dr. Peter Story, who once caught me unawares when he said in a sermon that indeed we need to genuflect before the beggar at the robot, because even that person bears the image of God. God has a history of including the others in His story. Ruth wasn't the first, and she was not the last. There is such strong speculation that Caleb in the Old Testament, the one who helped as a spy, was an Egyptian. You remember the wise men who came from Persia as Zoroastrian priests, who featured in the birth story of Christ. Matthew gives us the record in chapter 8 of the Roman centurion whose faith impressed Jesus. There's Simon of Cyrene, who carried the cross of Christ on that fateful day of his execution. For those who don't know, Cyrene is in North Africa. So even in Africa, an African has a place, a special place in the gospel story. And then, of course, I need to highlight that verse in the book of the Revelation, which makes it clear that one day in the hereafter, when we dance around God's dazzling throne, there will be multitudes from every culture and nation and color and tribe and language. For there, who we are classed as will definitely not matter. We need to learn, we who say that we follow Jesus, we need to learn how to build a respect-based and acceptance-driven society. For only then will the kingdom of God come in all its beauty. The second point, and of course, as I promised you, the last point for today, is that this morning we need to reawaken to the fact that because we are Jesus followers, we as Christians are seen, or should be seen, as foreigners in this world. For we don't live by this world's standards. We don't follow this world's value system. And we should never become a part of this rat race to nowhere. We are people of purpose and power and passion. People who know who we are and whose we are. People who know where we come from and where we are going to. And this should be clear for others to see from miles and miles away. It should be glaringly clear that when those in the world encounter us, that we are marching to the beat of a different drum. Just the other day, I quoted from Jesus' prayer in John 17, where Jesus talks to God about his disciples being in the world, but never of it. St. Paul goes as far as saying in his letter to the Ephesians that our citizenship is in heaven. The world economy disagrees with ours and the way we do things as Jesus followers. how we live should be strangely foreign to those who don't know him and want nothing to do with him. For instance, when the world screams, "Put your trust in human leaders," we are the ones who whisper, "No, our trust is in God and not in princes or presidents." When the world says, "Put yourself first, make sure that you are happy," we beg to differ by saying that we are called to live for others, sacrificially and humbly. When the world tries its best to convince us that justice is not worth fighting for, that it is okay to exploit the poor in order to have what you want, we are the ones who say, no. That's not the gospel message. For the gospel message could not be more clear in saying that the vulnerable have to be looked after and that the have-nots need to be cared for and have their cause defended by the church. Of course, the world also proudly says, you don't have to forgive. The system of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth works perfectly for those who don't follow Jesus. But also there we ask for the bus to halt, for we know the teachings of Jesus. We know that he took this forgiveness thing to another level when he said, don't only forgive your friends, but forgive even your enemy. Matthew chapter 6. You see, Jesus taught us how to live differently. For our passports come from another place. Our citizenship is in heaven. So we live our lives lovingly and gently. We forgive generously and we share what we have. That is the kingdom lifestyle. However offensive and unacceptable it looks to others. The values that we follow might look weird to those around us, peculiar and even senseless to those in the world. But as for believers, it is the only way. So I want to know from you, do people see us as those who have invaded the world, bringing in another kingdom of gentleness and understanding? Do people see us as those who don't really belong here, for we don't fit in so lekker? Are we here as strangers who are on our way to something better, brighter, more glorious? When others encounter us, do they see that we have a foreign faith? Do people see that our master is actually not a king who whips out a sword left, right, and center, but a servant who lays down his life for his friends? And do we do it so convincingly that others are not able to say no, wanting to be a part of this, wanting to be magnetically drawn to us and to this way of life, which we are absolutely convinced is the only worthwhile way of living? I'm going to bring this to an end as I ask you very kindly to try and remember these 2 points. There's one less as per usual, so you should manage just fine. Firstly, how do we treat foreigners? Do we represent Jesus and his kingdom to them when we meet? And secondly, do others see us as a good kind of foreigner, paving the way to heaven, pointing out the alternative way of living, the Jesus way, of course? We thank God for the story of Ruth. We thank God from what we learn from her as a foreigner. We thank God for how he includes all sorts to make his mission to the world happen. No matter how different others are, we need to invite them. We need to invite them to be part of God's exciting plan for the world. This plan, which is to bring salvation and wholeness to one and all. Amen.